Welcome to this explainer. We're unpacking the intricate mechanics of a highly influential, yet notoriously complex economic model today. We are looking directly at the economic engine that shapes our modern world, examining its gears, its fuel, and its structural stress points through a very specific historical lens. Let's jump right in.
We're diving straight into Karl Marx's theories of surplus value. Now, this is often considered the fourth volume of Capital, and honestly, it is incredibly dense. But our goal here is to impartially map out exactly how Marx argued this capitalist engine is built, how it runs on a day-to-day basis, and crucially, why, according to his structural analysis, it inevitably breaks down. We're keeping strictly to the mechanics of the theory itself, exactly as it's laid out in the text.
So, here's our roadmap. We're taking a building block approach today, starting with the core of surplus value, moving into the types of labor, then we'll hit constant and variable capital, explore modern accumulation, and finally look at how accumulation leads to crises.
All right, part one, the core of surplus value, the hidden fuel.
To really grasp this model, we have to look closely at what actually happens during a standard working day. According to Marx's model, a worker's shift is effectively split into two distinct parts. In the very first part, the worker produces just enough value to cover their own wages, basically what it costs to keep them fed, housed, and, well, returning to work the next day. But the working day doesn't stop there, does it? The second part of that shift is where surplus value is generated. This is entirely new value created by the worker that totally exceeds their wage cost, and this surplus is directly appropriated by the owner of the business.
Marx makes a really pointed argument here. The true aim of this whole system isn't just making a useful product, like, weaving cloth or forging steel, but generating this very specific mathematical surplus. Think about how this dynamic plays out. Once a worker has labored enough hours to reproduce the value of their daily sustenance, every single subsequent hour work is essentially free fuel for the capitalist's profit. The product itself, well, it's really just a vehicle to carry that surplus value into the open market.
Okay, moving right along to part two, types of labor. Productive versus unproductive.
Marx actually spends a huge amount of time here critiquing earlier economists, especially Adam Smith, on this exact distinction. In this strict theoretical framework, being productive doesn't just mean making a physical thing or doing something socially useful. Not at all. It specifically means labor that is exchanged for capital in order to expand that capital by creating surplus value. Unproductive labor, on the flip side, is exchanged simply for revenue just to consume it, usually in the form of a personal service.
Let's look at some really surprising examples straight from the theory. An industrial cotton spinner? Productive, because their work generates a profit for the factory. But what about a circus clown? Believe it or not, in this framework, the clown is absolutely productive if their performance generates a profit for the circus owner. Meanwhile, a tailor who comes to your house to patch up your trousers is unproductive in this strict mechanical sense. Why? Because they're just providing a use value for your personal consumption, not expanding a giant pool of capital. It completely flips our everyday definitions on their head.
All right, let's keep building. Part three, constant and variable capital, machine components. We've looked at the fuel and the workers, so let's see how the machine itself is categorized into two distinct parts.
The very first category is constant capital. This includes your heavy machinery, your massive factory buildings, and raw materials like coal, cotton, or timber. The theory argues that this part of the capital is totally static when it comes to value creation. Look at it this way. A machine slowly transfers its pre-existing cost into the product as it wears out over the years, say over a 10 or 12-year lifespan, but it never magically multiplies its own value. It simply passes on the exact value of the past labor that it took to build it in the first place.
The second category, then, is variable capital. This is the portion of the investment expended entirely on human labor power, meaning wages. In this model, variable capital is the active, dynamic ingredient. Because human beings uniquely have the capacity to produce way more value than they actually consume to survive, this is the literal only part of the investment that actually generates new surplus value during the production process.
It's fascinating when you look at the math, comparing, say, cotton spinning to mechanized agriculture. They have totally different organic compositions, meaning entirely different ratios of constant machinery to variable human wages. Cotton spinning uses a really high ratio of expensive materials and machines. Agriculture, on the other hand, might use less machinery, but way more human labor. Yet structurally, the theory insists that the surplus always originates exclusively from the variable human element. It doesn't matter if there are thousands of tons of coal or steel involved in the process. The new value comes entirely from the people.
Which naturally leads us to ask, what happens when this engine is put into motion on a massive, societal scale? Part 4, Modern Accumulation, Industrial Expansion. The thing is, the system literally cannot stand still. Accumulation isn't just some Scrooge McDuck capitalist hoarding gold coins in a vault. It's a constant, never-ending, cyclical reinvestment. The capitalist extracts the surplus value, instantly converts a portion of it back into capital, purchases additional machinery, and expands the massive scale of production. Rinse and repeat.
But as this intense drive for efficiency and massive scale pushes forward, something fundamental shifts beneath the surface. The system's organic composition changes. Driven by fierce competition and the constant need for greater productivity, the proportion of investment spent on heavy machinery, that constant capital we talked about, absolutely balloons. Consequently, the relative share spent on human wages, the variable capital, starts to shrink. The machine becomes heavier, vastly more mechanized, and increasingly reliant on past, materialized labor rather than living, breathing workers.
And that brings us to the climax of this explainer. Part 5, Accumulation and Crises, System Breakdowns. Let's see how this very mechanical design practically guarantees that it will periodically break down. The theory identifies a fatal systemic contradiction right at the heart of the engine. On one side, you have this limitless drive to accumulate. The capitalist mandate is to continuously expand production, utilizing all those massive new machines to the absolute maximum, completely ignoring the actual physical limits of the market. But on the other side, you have the narrow limits of consumption. The vast majority of the population are workers whose wages, that shrinking variable capital, are structurally restricted to just what is strictly necessary for their survival and reproduction, so they simply can't buy all this stuff. This contradiction acts exactly like a pressure cooker, inevitably blowing up into a crisis. The text describes a brutal causal chain reaction. Phase 1. The massive drive to accumulate pushes rapid, unsustainable overproduction. Phase 2. The markets completely glut because the restricted wages of the masses mean they just cannot afford to buy back the absolute mountain of commodities they just produced. Prices plummet way below their actual cost. Phase 3. The simple act of selling commodities to make money, what the text formalizes as the reconversion of commodities back into money, just halts. The cash flow completely stops. And finally, Phase 4. The separation of purchase and sale spirals into a nightmare of cascading bankruptcies. The gears grind to a violent halt.
What this reveals is that economic crises in this model don't just, briefly pause the system, they violently destroy capital. And this destruction is twofold. First, there's massive physical destruction, idle machinery quite literally rusting away in locked factories, mass unemployment of productive labor, and mountains of raw materials just sitting unused. Then, there's the massive destruction of exchange value. Commodity prices plunge, wiping out all that nominal capital on paper overnight. The old capitalists go completely bankrupt, and wealth rapidly transfers to new, opportunistic owners who just swoop in, buy up the depreciated assets at rock-bottom prices, and set the stage for the engine to start up all over again.
I really want to highlight this incredibly powerful observation straight from the source text. Crisis is the forcible establishment of unity between elements that have become independent and the enforced separation from one another of elements which are essentially one. That encapsulates the whole mechanical model right there. A crisis isn't viewed as some random accident or a little mistake in fiscal policy. No, it is a violent, forced correction of an economic engine that has completely outpaced its own internal mechanics. It's a necessary purge to forcefully realign the system's capacity to produce with the population's capacity to consume.
We've unpacked the hidden surplus, the relentless shift toward constant capital, and the inevitable violent systemic breakdowns as theorized in these historical texts. But as we look around at our modern global markets today, markets completely driven by algorithms, artificial intelligence, and hyper-fast digital services, it leaves us with a truly fascinating question to ponder. Have the fundamental gears of this machine actually changed today, or are they just spinning faster than ever before? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the mechanics of the world around you.